What if I told you the greatest threat to capitalism today isn't failure, it's favoritism? Not bad companies, protected companies, not competition, curated outcomes, not the free market, but the quiet moment when power decides who gets to win. Because the moment government stops setting the rules and starts picking the champions, something dangerous happens. Innovation slows, prices rise, trust collapses, and while a few corporations celebrate special deals, the rest of the economy quietly pays the price. This isn't theory. This isn't politics. This is what happens every single time markets are replaced with negotiations. The deals look impressive. The headlines sound patriotic. But behind the scenes, the cost is being passed to workers, to consumers, to entrepreneurs who never got a seat at the table. Today, we're going to talk about what really happens when power replaces competition, why protection weakens economies, why favoritism kills innovation, and why, in the end, all of us lose when winners are chosen instead of earned. Stay with me, because once you see it, you can't unsee it. The foundation of a strong economy has never been built on favoritism. It has been built on competition, discipline, and the relentless pressure of the market to reward excellence and expose weakness. When governments step beyond setting fair rules and begin choosing who should win and who should lose, the entire system begins to erode. What may appear in the short term as strategic intervention is often nothing more than a distortion that weakens trust and undermines growth. Free markets work because they are impartial. They do not care about political access, corporate size, or proximity to power. They reward companies that innovate, allocate capital efficiently, and deliver real value. Once government replaces that process with negotiated outcomes and selective deals, competition stops being fair. The rules change, not because of merit, but because of influence. That is not capitalism. It is a managed economy disguised as one. When officials begin striking special arrangements with certain corporations, they unintentionally send a dangerous message. Success is no longer earned in the marketplace, but negotiated in private rooms. Smaller businesses, entrepreneurs, and new entrants find themselves competing not only against rivals, but against policy itself. They are asked to carry the full weight of regulation and tariffs while others receive exemptions and protections. Over time, this discourages risk-taking, slows innovation, and concentrates power in the hands of the few. The irony is that policies designed to protect domestic strength often achieve the opposite. Shielded from competition, favored companies lose the incentive to improve, productivity declines, costs rise, and ultimately consumers pay the price. Through higher prices, fewer choices, and slower economic progress, markets thrive on pressure. Remove that pressure and efficiency fades. History has shown repeatedly that economies grow strongest when governments resist the temptation to engineer outcomes. The role of policy should be to create a level playing field, transparent rules, predictable enforcement, and equal treatment. Once that balance is lost, capital flows toward political advantage rather than productive opportunity. Talent follows influence instead of ideas. That is a misallocation no economy can afford. This is not an argument for doing nothing. It is an argument for doing the right thing. Governments should invest in education, infrastructure, and the rule of law, not in selecting corporate champions. Prosperity does not come from deals. It comes from discipline. It does not come from protection. It comes from competition. The moment we accept that the state should decide which companies succeed, we abandon the very principles that created opportunity in the first place. And when that happens, the damage does not stop at balance sheets or stock prices. It reaches workers, consumers, innovators, everyone who depends on a fair and functioning market. When government starts picking winners, the system stops working for the many and starts working for the connected. And in that kind of economy, no matter how it is justified, everyone eventually pays the price. When policy drifts away from principle, it creates space for something far more corrosive than bad economics. It creates a system where access matters more than ability. That is how crony capitalism takes root. It does not announce itself loudly. It arrives quietly, wrapped in the language of protection, national interest, or strategic necessity. But beneath the surface, it replaces competition with connections and discipline with discretion. In a healthy market, success is earned in the open. Companies compete, fail, adapt, and improve. Capital flows toward those who use it best. But once government begins intervening through selective favors, exemptions, or negotiated outcomes, the incentives change. Instead of investing in productivity or innovation, firms begin investing in influence. Lobbyists become as important as engineers. Political proximity starts to outperform operational excellence. This is where tariffs and special corporate arrangements become dangerous. On paper, they may look like tools to defend domestic industry. In practice, they often function as barriers that protect incumbents while suffocating challengers. Large, well-connected firms can absorb the cost, negotiate exemptions, or shift burdens downstream. Smaller companies cannot. Startups cannot. New entrants are locked out before they ever have a chance to compete. The result is an economy that looks strong on the surface but weak underneath. Market concentration increases, innovation slows, prices rise, and consumers, the very people these policies claim to protect, end up paying more for less. Crony capitalism does not create resilience. It creates fragility. It builds companies that survive not because they are better, but because they are shielded. What makes this especially dangerous is that it erodes trust. Once the public believes outcomes are driven by political favor rather than merit, confidence in the system collapses. Workers lose faith that effort will be rewarded. Entrepreneurs hesitate to take risks. Investors question whether markets are allocating capital efficiently or simply reflecting policy distortions. That loss of trust is far more damaging than any short-term economic disruption. There is also a moral cost. When governments reward proximity over performance, they signal that rules are flexible for the powerful and rigid for everyone else. That undermines the idea of fairness that markets depend on. Capitalism only works when participants believe the game is honest. Once that belief disappears, the system no longer inspires ambition. It breeds cynicism. History offers no shortage of warnings. Economies that slide into cronyism rarely collapse overnight. They stagnate slowly. Growth becomes dependent on favors. Productivity lags peers. Eventually, the cost becomes impossible to ignore. By then, reversing course is far more difficult than resisting the temptation in the first place. The alternative is not complicated, but it requires restraint. Governments must enforce rules, not bend them. They must promote competition, not protection for the connected. They must accept that not every company should be saved, and not every industry can be engineered into success. When the state begins substituting judgment for the market's discipline, it does not strengthen capitalism. It hollows it out. And once crony capitalism takes hold, the economy stops serving the many and starts serving the few. That is not a flaw we can afford to normalize, because systems built on favoritism do not fail fairly, they fail completely. Innovation has never been the product of comfort. It is born from pressure, competition, and the constant threat of being replaced by something better. When markets are allowed to function freely, companies are forced to earn their relevance every day. They innovate not because they are protected, but because they are challenged. The moment government policy begins insulating certain players from that pressure, innovation slows and fairness quietly disappears. A market tilted by selective policy does not reward the best ideas, it rewards the best access. When exemptions, subsidies, or special arrangements are introduced, they create artificial advantages that have nothing to do with performance. Large corporations with resources to navigate political systems gain protection, while smaller firms, often the true engines of innovation, are left to compete uphill. That imbalance distorts incentives across the entire economy. Small and mid-sized businesses do not have teams of lobbyists or the leverage to negotiate favorable terms. What they have is agility, creativity, and the willingness to take risks. These are the very qualities that drive progress. But when policy begins favoring incumbents, those qualities are punished rather than rewarded. The message becomes clear: scale and influence matter more than ingenuity. Over time, fewer entrepreneurs take the leap, and fewer breakthrough ideas reach the market. Fairness is not an abstract concept in capitalism. It is a prerequisite. Markets function because participants believe the rules apply equally. When that belief is undermined, trust erodes. Entrepreneurs stop asking how to build better products and start asking how to survive an uneven playing field. Investors become cautious, not because opportunity is gone, but because the rules are unpredictable. Innovation thrives on clarity. Policy favoritism creates uncertainty. There is also a long-term cost that rarely makes headlines. When favored companies are shielded from competition, they lose urgency. Research budgets become less disciplined. Operational efficiency weakens. Talent migrates towards security rather than ambition. The entire system begins to settle into mediocrity, not because the people lack ability, but because the environment no longer demands excellence. Meanwhile, consumers experience the consequences directly. Reduced competition leads to higher prices, fewer choices, and slower improvements in quality. What begins as an effort to protect industry ends up penalizing households. Innovation, after all, is not just about technology. It is about delivering better outcomes for people. When that cycle breaks, everyone feels it. The most resilient economies in the world share one trait: they allow failure. Companies that cannot compete are forced to adapt or exit, making room for new ideas and new leaders. This process is uncomfortable, but it is essential. Attempts to override it with policy protection only delay the inevitable while increasing the eventual cost. If the goal is sustainable growth, the path is clear. Encourage competition. Enforce rules consistently. Let capital and talent flow tower. Merit. Do not mistake intervention for strength. Markets do not need to be engineered to innovate. They need to be trusted. When policy protects power instead of progress, innovation slows and fairness fades. And once that happens, the economy may still function, but it no longer moves forward. Economic policy is often debated in abstractions, but its consequences are felt in very real ways by very real people. When governments intervene in markets by selecting corporate winners, the cost does not remain confined to balance sheets or boardrooms. It travels quickly and quietly to households, workers, and consumers. The burden shows up in higher prices, reduced opportunity, and a slower pace of economic progress that compounds over time. Tariffs and selective protections are frequently framed as tools to defend domestic strength. In practice, they function as taxes, and like most poorly designed taxes, they are regressive. The cost is embedded in everyday goods, passed along through supply chains, and ultimately absorbed by families who have the least flexibility to absorb it. What appears to be a policy aimed at corporations often becomes a tax on groceries, appliances, housing, and transportation. Workers are told these measures will preserve jobs, but the reality is more complicated. When companies are shielded from competition, productivity declines. Investment shifts away from efficiency and toward compliance. Growth slows and wage gains stagnate. Job security built on protection is fragile because it depends not on performance, but on political will. When that protection fades, and it always does, the adjustment is more painful than if markets had been allowed to evolve. Naturally, consumers face fewer choices and higher costs. Innovation slows, quality improvements arrive later, and competition narrows. These effects rarely generate immediate outrage because they unfold gradually. But over time, the cumulative impact is significant. A household paying a little more for everything is effectively paying an invisible tax for policies that promise strength but deliver distortion. There is also a regional and social dimension that cannot be ignored. Policy favoritism tends to concentrate benefits in specific industries and geographies, while spreading costs broadly across the population. That imbalance fuels resentment and deepens economic divides. When people sense that the system favors the connected over the capable, confidence in institutions weakens. Economic frustration turns into social instability, and the price of that instability far exceeds any short-term gains from intervention. Markets, when allowed to function, are powerful equalizers. They reward effort, skill, and adaptability. Interference disrupts that process. Capital becomes less mobile. Talent becomes more cautious. Opportunity narrows. These are not theoretical risks. They are patterns observed repeatedly when policy replaces competition. The tragedy is that these outcomes are avoidable. Governments do not need to choose between compassion and competition. The most effective policies focus on people, not companies, education that prepares workers for change, infrastructure that supports growth, and safety nets that help individuals transition without freezing the economy in place. When policy attempts to freeze outcomes rather than enable mobility, it creates stagnation disguised as stability. The economy may look protected, but it becomes brittle. And when the next disruption arrives, the costs are higher, the adjustment harsher, and the people least able to afford it pay the most. Intervention that promises protection often delivers constraint. And when the true cost comes due, it is not paid by policy architects or corporate beneficiaries. It is paid by everyone else. Sustainable prosperity has never been engineered through deals or decrees. It emerges when markets are trusted to allocate capital, reward talent, and discipline failure. The strongest economies are not those where outcomes are negotiated, but those where opportunity is open and competition is relentless. When governments respect that boundary, growth becomes durable. When they cross it, progress becomes fragile. Open markets are not perfect, but they are adaptive. They respond to change faster than policy ever can. They absorb shocks, reallocate resources, and surface better solutions through trial and error. Attempts to manage outcomes from the top down may feel decisive, but they rarely age well. Economic strength is not created by protecting today's winners. It is created by making room for tomorrow's innovators. The role of government is not to predict which companies or industries will succeed. History is unforgiving to those predictions. Instead, policy should focus on creating conditions where success is earned, clear rules, equal enforcement, and a stable framework that allows long-term planning. When those conditions exist, capital flows toward productivity and talent flows toward opportunity. That is how real growth compounds. Prosperity built on favoritism is inherently unstable. It depends on continued protection and constant intervention. It encourages dependency rather than resilience. Companies learn to optimize for policy rather than performance, and economies lose their capacity to adapt. Over time, the distance between protected incumbents and aspiring challengers widens, and the system becomes less dynamic, less innovative, and less fair. There is a temptation, especially during periods of uncertainty, to believe that control equals safety. But control in economic policy often produces the opposite. Markets need freedom to adjust. Workers need mobility, not guarantees that lock them into declining industries. Investors need transparency, not discretion. Stability comes from flexibility, not from freezing the status quo. The most successful economies have embraced this reality. They invest in people, not preferences. They focus on education, skills, and infrastructure, the foundations that allow individuals and businesses to compete globally. They recognize that failure, while painful, is part of progress. Shielding economies from change does not eliminate disruption. It postpones it and magnifies its impact. True leadership in economic policy requires restraint. It requires the discipline to resist short-term political wins in favor of long-term prosperity. It requires trust in systems that are bigger than any administration or agenda. When governments step back from picking winners, they allow society's collective intelligence, millions of decisions made every day, to drive progress. The future will not be defined by who received the best deal or the strongest protection. It will be defined by who adapted, who innovated, and who competed. Economies that understand this will continue to grow. Those that do not will slowly fall behind, not because they lacked ambition, but because they misunderstood where real strength comes from. Open markets are not a theory. They are a proven engine of opportunity. When we let them work, prosperity is shared, progress is constant, and growth is earned. That is not ideology. It is experience. So the question isn't whether deals can be made. The question is what they cost us. Because every time power replaces competition, something essential is lost. Not loudly, not immediately, but quietly, in slower innovation, higher prices, fewer chances, and a system that no longer rewards the best. Only the connected, strong economies, not built in private meetings. They are built in open markets. They are built when success is earned, failure is allowed, and opportunity is not reserved for those with access. The illusion of control may feel comforting. The headlines may sound strong, but strength that depends on favoritism is weakness in disguise. History is clear. Prosperity doesn't come from protection. It comes from pressure. It comes from competition. And it comes from the discipline to let markets do what they've always done best, separate value from influence. Because the moment we accept that winners should be chosen instead of earned, we don't just lose efficiency. We lose fairness. We lose trust. And eventually we lose growth. And that's the real cost. Not for one company, not for one industry, but for everyone.